What I'm going to be discussing is how industry is in a way reacting to this regulatory regime and what kind of tools we need to look into to enable industry to really implement these regulations, these standards, and where they want to even be more ambitious, if that is something that parties are interested in doing. So when I talk today, I'm going to be looking at two main areas. I'm going to mainly be looking at banking and finance and green chartering as two areas for pluralistic governance solutions. So we've had the regulatory regime, we've spoken about the CII standard and the EEXI standards. We've also spoken a bit by Eric's presentation about Fit for 55 and the emissions trading scheme and the market-based measures that the EU is looking at. So there is a lot of work really going on in the regulatory landscape, but my interest is mainly on how are private actors reacting to these regulatory responses and what kind of research is needed in these areas, particularly with the diversification and the emergence of green finance frameworks. How are these being implemented by the banking sector or by private actors? And then green chartering, what kind of discussions are going on in charter parties and contracting? And how are private actors dealing with these standards in bilateral agreements? And are there suitable contractual mechanisms to actually deal with sustainability? So there's a big contract governance debate going on right now that informs this discussion more widely, which is, should contract law be used for sustainable purposes? Should we be governing contract law to provide actors with a set of remedies and enforcement mechanisms that can enable them to implement a sustainability agenda, whether that be decarbonization or sustainability more generally? And the reason I'm looking at this is not just for fun, not just because, it's an interesting piece of research, but because the IMO itself has called for pluralistic governance solutions. The IMO has used language such as the enrollment of private actors into the regulatory regime to provide pluralistic governance solutions for green shipping. So people tend to put all their eggs in the IMO basket, but there are a lot of stakeholders and a lot of actors involved and who are going to be involved in the decarbonization of the sector. And they all need to be on board and they all need to be making their contributions in one way or another. So the first area I'm going to look at is green finance. Now, what is green finance? Well, it is endorsed by the United Nations as all the initiatives taken by private and public agents in developing, promoting, implementing, and supporting projects with sustainable impacts through financial instruments. And the reason we've seen such development in green finance is because energy transitions require huge capital investments. And this investment is going to have to come from both the public and the private sector. So we need to see the mobilization of a large amount of funds, and that is not a unique problem to shipping. All economic sectors need to transition, and it requires vast amounts of capital. Now, this is contentious because climate activists feel, well, governments have money, available for the things they want to do to maybe give their friends fraudulent tenders or do other things. But when it comes to energy transitions, they suddenly have no money. So that's a contentious point from climate activism perspective. But the reality is it is going to require huge capital investment to transition most economic sectors. And a big question is, where is this money going to come from? So this real impetus to mobilize funds has resulted in a diverse range of financial products, policy responses, as well as regulatory interventions. So we've seen kind of this plethora of responses, but these responses have come with their own risk. Initially, there was a huge diversification. There was inconsistency of definitions as to what constitutes sustainable, what constitutes green. So initially, when green finance in 2016 really took off, there was a lot of debate and discussion as to needing to provide a common language for green finance, needing to talk about what certain, definitions mean. What is a green activity? What is a sustainable activity? So a lot of the legal development around this has been the development of taxonomy initiatives, taxonomy frameworks, the most prominent one, which is the EU taxonomy regulation. So these frameworks have emerged to address this problem of terminology and to talk about what we mean by green, sustainable, or climate aligned. So there's all this language that is thrown around, but what do we mean by green projects? Now, the importance of green finance frameworks and taxonomies is not only to provide these legal definitions of what constitutes green, but they're also seen by governments and stakeholders to overcome some of the key barriers to energy transitions. And these barriers involve uncertainty regarding regulatory change and technical capacity. There's also disagreement about optimal solutions. So in shipping, what is the optimal solution in terms of technology? I mean, is it to put sails on ships? Do we need to find zero emission fuels? We don't really have strong direction as to what technological tools are available. There's also the issue of distribution of power between actors, both state and non-state. So green finance purports to overcome these barriers by directing actors to certain economic activities, which are defined as either green or sustainable, depending on the framework that you're dealing with. So the idea is that these frameworks will help private actors develop financial offerings and give them the confidence they need to develop financial products, knowing that these products are going to be robust to regulatory uncertainty and that they are going to channel funds and finance to vetted activities that are approved by governments or voluntary framework initiatives. We also know that for banks, these are very important frameworks because environmental risks are growing. So there's a huge amount of climate litigation going on. So whether you think that is a massive risk or not, and whether you think litigation is the best way to express climate activism is up for debate. But the reality is that risks are mounting. Greenwashing claims are mounting. We're seeing a number of task force being set up at both regional and domestic levels to deal with greenwashing claims in advertising, in competition law, in consumer law. So greenwashing is really starting to pose a threat, and that is whereby companies purport to be more green than they actually are, or purport to do things that are sustainable when in reality their activities are not that sustainable. From a banking perspective, greenwashing means where a financial product is advertised as green, but it isn't actually channeled towards activities which are all that green in terms of what we understand green to be, and also aligned with a taxonomy framework. So the EU has really done a lot of work in respect of green finance, and originally it provided targeted financial products in 3 ways. So before the implementation of the EU taxonomy, the way that shipping actors could access funding, particularly through the EIB, was under a traditional lending program. And then there were these 2 products which were designed specifically for shipping, called the Green Shipping Guarantee Program and the Green Shipping Loan Program. So these were EIB initiatives. The problem with them is they were very difficult from an accessibility perspective because they had very complex criteria. It was very difficult in a way to access these funds, and the administrative burden was extremely high. So to be eligible for these programs, there were a number of demanding tick box exercises that you had to fulfill. And then you also had to situate these products within a wider policy framework. So the 10T policy, motorways of the seas. So I think the European Union has learned a lot from its EIB products going forward in the development of its taxonomy regulation. So we now have had the implementation of the EU Green Finance Taxonomy, and this is really kind of a regulatory response to what was happening in the banking sector, but it kind of gives private actors and it gives the banking sector the tools and the language that they might need to develop financial product offerings. And this taxonomy regulation purports or provides 4 overarching criteria for environmentally sustainable economic activities that banks should be channeling green finance towards in their green product offerings. So these are activities that contribute to one or more of the environmental objectives set out in Article 9, does not significantly harm any of the environmental objectives, is carried out in compliance with minimum safeguards, and complies with technical screening criteria that have been established by the Commission. So the Green Finance Taxonomy Regulation provides the overarching regulation, but it is then supplemented by delegated acts, which actually provide the technical screening criteria for activities. So the first delegated act, also called the Climate Delegated Act, are those activities which contribute to climate adaptation and climate mitigation. And the second delegated act, which is still a work in progress, called the Environmental Delegated Act, which is not yet in force, refers to those other Article 9 objectives, mainly dealing with environmental outputs, ecosystems, so those things that are not specifically related to carbon emissions, such as climate adaptation or mitigation. Shipping has been included in the first delegated act. So banks have kind of been given the regulatory go-ahead to go and develop products. And the activities included in the technical screening criteria, which involve shipping, are things such as inland passenger water transport, freight water transport, retrofitting of inland water passenger and freight transport, and then sea and coastal freight water transport, vessels for port operations, and other activities. So most of these activities will then provide criteria for what sorts of operations would qualify for green finance. And under all of these categories, if the vessel in question emits 0 direct tailpipe emissions, it will clearly fall within the ambit of the taxonomy. And then there are a number of other sub-criteria. If it uses so much percentage onshore power, if it uses green fuel, it will also be included in the taxonomy Climate Delegated Act. So this has really given the banking sector the go-ahead to develop products that are aligned with these technical screening criteria for shipping. But there have also been a number of voluntary frameworks which have provided green taxonomy initiatives. So first, we had the Common Principles for Climate Change Adaptation and Finance Tracking. So this was a group of multilateral banks who got together to provide a common language for what constitutes green sustainable. It was less relevant to shipping, but more focused on urban transport. But what it did is it really helped develop the green bond market. So we saw that initiative really directed towards banks in issuing green bonds. And then that was followed by the International Capital Market Association's Green Bond Principles, which does include clean transportation. And subsequently, the Green Bond Principles, there's also Sustainable Bond Principles and Social Bond Principles. But subsequent to the Green Bond Principles, you also needed to have Green Loan Principles. Because if you're issuing bonds for green activities, you then need to have green loans to control the proceeds of funds for these bonds. And then we had the Climate Bonds Initiative Certification Standard. So the CBI standard is widely used by many financial institutions as a kind of seal of approval that your activities are climate aligned. It provides green light and red light activities as to what falls under the definition of a climate aligned activity. So there are some green light activities for shipping, although it's fairly broadly worded as to what those activities are, 0 emissions, but it doesn't really help you with technology selection per se. And then Poseidon Principles is very well known. So this is a purely industry initiative where a group of banks have come together to say that they are going to declare that their shipping portfolios are climate aligned. Now, with all of these taxonomy efforts, you have to ask yourself, how are we going to enforce them? How are they going to be enforced? That's a big question. If a bank is saying that it offers a green loan or it has a green product on offer, is it really green? And how does the bank ensure that it is protected from risk against greenwashing claims or other climate risks that might emerge if it so transpires that the proceeds are not being used for green activities? So there's some contractual guidance given, because the main way banks are going to implement these is through contracts, through their bond documentation and through their loan documentation in shipping. The Loan Market Association provides forms for sustainability-linked loans. So there's been quite a bit of extensive contractual guidance given for those institutions which are developing sustainability-linked loan product offerings. Now, a sustainability-linked loan is quite different from the LMA green loan. A sustainability-linked loan is more of a flexible instrument in that the loan is really targeted towards assisting the borrower in improving its sustainability performance. So that is quite different from a green loan, which is a use of proceeds product. A green loan is where you channel funds towards a specific designated activity. So the banks will decide what activities, in terms of its taxonomy criteria that it's applying, they'll decide what activities are green, and then they will basically contract on green loan forms for those activities. So the use of proceeds have to be for a very specific set of activities. Sustainability linked loans, far more flexible. The borrower even gets to choose their own key performance indicators as a benchmark standard, and you really are just instructed to improve sustainability performance over time. We've seen a lot of interesting work being done by the Chancery Lane project. Now, the Chancery Lane project started off as quite a small initiative based in London, which developed what you call a climate clause bank. So they had a number of climate clauses for each economic sector that practitioners could use to implement decarbonisation standards into their contracts, including their green loan starter pack. Because the LMA hasn't given us much guidance on the green loan principles and their implementation in contractual documentation. So the Chancery Lane project has aimed to fill that gap. And it also gives us a lot of template clauses in the form of climate clauses for green loans. And then the Poseidon Principles, which is that purely industry initiative, uses a standard covenant clause. Now, the Poseidon Principles commitment at this point is really just alignment with IMO standards, which I think most shipping companies probably have to do anyway. So really, it's just disclosure that your shipping portfolio is aligned with IMO standards, and signatories have to commit via the standard covenant clause to provide the information necessary to show that their portfolios are aligned with IMO regulations. Now, what is interesting about these green finance contracts and how they implement these taxonomy regulations or taxonomy frameworks is we're starting to see an emergence of a new kind of climate drafting, which does not really sit very comfortably with English contract law. So we're seeing in these loan forms recitals, so purpose of loan provisions, including green commitments. And in these recitals or purpose of loan provisions, we're seeing very broadly worded commitments for parties cooperating together to improve sustainability performance or to share data. So recitals are an important contractual tool in that they assist in the construction and interpretation of other contractual terms in the loan agreement, in that they can really inform how other obligations are to be carried out. And then what we're seeing with these kinds of loan agreements for the implementation of green taxonomy criteria is something called a declassification event. So by and large, if a vessel does not act sustainably or there's a breach of an obligation in the green loan agreement, the product itself will not say that this triggers an event of default, rather the loan will be declassified. So it will lose its status as a green loan, or it will lose its status as a sustainability linked loan. And then the ship owner or the borrower cannot advertise its activities as green in terms of the LMA green loan principles or sustainability linked principles. So whether you think things should merely be declassified or whether you think they should trigger an event of default is quite contentious, because how strongly do banks take these commitments if they are not willing to say that, sustainability breaches or green breaches do not actually trigger an event of default and merely just declassifies the project? On the other hand, the whole purpose of green finance is to still allow for the facilitation of commercial activities. So really, green finance frameworks are not there to hinder commercial activity. The idea behind them is that a commercially viable project should still go ahead, and the framework itself acts as a carrot rather than a sticked mechanism. So that's probably the logic behind having these declassification events as opposed to event of default provisions. We're also seeing margin adjustments or interest ratchet clauses being applied. So under, for example, the sustainability linked loans, for borrowers who comply with their obligations, who consistently improve sustainability performance, they should be offered preferential interest rates. However, this is not really being carried out in practice. There's still very de minimis benefits for users who make use of these products. So really the incentive is not there strongly enough, because in practice we see that sustainability linked loans are not actually offering fantastic interest rate offerings, although they should. And the idea is that these kind of loans should be far more attractive to borrowers than other kinds of loans. And otherwise, we see green standards integrated into all other aspects of the loan form documentation, whether that be condition precedents, warranties, or events of defaults. So moving on to chartering, we've seen that the response for mobilizing money has come from green finance, which has been through a few initiatives, whether they be regulatory or voluntary and industry-led. And there's a lot of work going on in green finance to kind of implement these taxonomies. But green chartering is one that I think industry is finding a bit more difficult to get their heads around. It is really a hotspot area for the sustainable contract law debates. And despite, kind of what people are doing in practice, and we have this wonderful sustainable development agenda, and we have the Paris Accord, we see that laissez-faire contract law has remained very resilient to any meaningful intersection with that kind of regulatory agenda. And it's also remained very resilient to any attempt at embedding it in a wider socio-political context. So particularly within England, the jurisdiction of England and Wales, there's been a reversion to formalism in recent times. And there's a huge reluctance to interfere with the default rules of contract law. So the formalists would argue that we need to have a minimalistic approach to contract law and its default rules, saying that, parties should be given complete contractual freedom, complete autonomy, and we need to keep these default rules to an absolute minimum. But on the other side of that, there are certain people will say that is an out of touch approach. Because the reality is actually that the common law does not really remain the main regulator of contracts. And this formalistic approach is actually just reflective of the fact that there's less judicial intervention in contract law than there was in previous times. So where you stand on that side of the argument, I suppose, is up to you. But the reality is that contracts are being modernized within practice, and you can say, well, that's along the lines of freedom of contract. Parties can create whatever clauses they want to. But the question really is, in creating these new clauses, because we are seeing, the uptake of sustainability clauses and climate clauses, is traditional English contract law really equipped to enforce these clauses? Are these clauses something which perhaps have the potential to modernize existing contractual law mechanisms for sustainability purposes? And as such, private actors are increasingly relying on contract governance approaches to implement the sustainability agenda. So when it comes to green chartering, the industry initiatives and responses are really centered on this idea: how do we govern that relationship between ship owner and time charter? And this really comes from the fact that charter parties, as contracts, are not governed by international conventions, but by common law. And we all know kind of the main customary duties which can be implied into these contracts, but which exist in standard forms in any event, such as seaworthiness, reasonable dispatch. So we have a very kind of traditional contractual architecture when it comes to chartering and charter party forms. And furthermore, because the industry is so inherently traditional, we have a very small pool of charter party standard forms to choose from. The most classic ones being the NYPE, and most ship owners still showing a preference for NYPE 46, as opposed to more recent iterations of the form. So you've got an inherently traditional sector that really applies formalistic contract law and is less susceptible to kind of the social milieu and the climate milieu than other sectors might find themselves. But the problem with the traditional architecture of these charter party forms from a sustainability perspective is that the idea of split incentives is embedded in them, particularly in a time charter. We know the owner pays for energy efficiency and upgrades the vessel accordingly, and the charterer benefits from fuel savings. So a lot of economic research has been done in game theory to kind of say, well, how do we overcome this issue of split incentives? How do we share the costs between owner and charterer? Because really this idea of split incentives, also known as the principal agent problem, has really come to define the main barrier to sustainability and decarbonization within chartering practice. So how is industry responding to this? And how are they addressing the issue of split incentives to comply with carbon dioxide regulations and voluntary commitments? Well, they are developing a number of climate clauses. So I've spoken a bit about the Chancery Lane project and the work it is doing. So it is, and I'll show you what they look like soon, but the Chancery Lane project has developed clauses specifically for charter parties to help parties to work together to share costs of green technology, and to also for both parties to benefit from fuel savings. And then the BIMCO carbon intensity indicator clause is quite a striking example of a climate clause, although it does not purport to be. But it really uses a lot of the similar obligations and undertakings that climate clauses do use. Now, BIMCO is very experienced at drafting environmental provisions for contracts and charter parties specifically. But by and large, I think since the RecycleCon, we haven't seen anything too groundbreaking. We haven't seen anything that kind of pushes the envelope. And I would say the CII clause really goes a bit beyond what BIMCO usually does in terms of its drafting. It usually views ship owner charterer as two parties in a bilateral agreement with these opposing interests. It recently also drafted the emission trading allowance clause, which was typical of, I would say, BIMCO style of drafting, in that, you know, the charterer surrenders to the ship owner emission allowances, much as he would payment of hire of the vessel. So there was nothing too groundbreaking with that. But the CII clause is causing a real headache for ship owners and practitioners because it's using this very ambitious, broadly worded language of climate drafting. And then we've got the Sea Cargo Charter Template Clause. The Sea Cargo Charter is also a purely industry initiative of ship owners who have come together to say that they are going to disclose the climate alignment of their chartering activities. So that is a big industry initiative, and it's implemented by way of a template clause. So I hope that the message I'm starting to drive home is that all of these initiatives really require a look at contract law, and they require an approach which considers contracts as a pluralistic governance solution. So that is really the message I'm trying to drive home. But let's talk a bit more about this BIMCO CII clause, which I think is quite typical of climate clause drafting. So the clause itself is much longer than this. It comprises definitions, it comprises even reference to IMO standards, but there's some language here that is causing a lot of confusion and which has really attracted a lot of criticism from London law firms. is this idea that the parties shall cooperate and work together in good faith. Okay, that's not something that sits too comfortably, particularly with shipping actors, and they must share any findings and best practices that they may identify on potential improvements to the vessel's energy efficiency. And then there's this huge data reporting burden. On a daily basis, they must collect, share, and report. And it's not just these broadly worded commitments that characterize this clause as a climate clause, but embedded in this clause are other things such as advanced warning mechanisms. So if you think the vessel is not going to operate in accordance with the agreed carbon intensity, then you need to warn the other party in advance, which clearly sits quite uncomfortably with our rules for anticipatory breach in English common law. And the BIMCO CII clause actually is quite similar in many ways to the Chancery Lane's climate clause provisions. So it has drafted 4 clauses specifically for charter parties. There's a fuel reporting clause. There's an energy efficiency in shipping. So Otto's clause, which is the energy efficiency one, basically requires parties to work together to maximize energy efficiency. And then there's also incentivizing fuel efficiency in time-chartered vessels, which is a mechanism for parties to share the cost of upgrades and to improve fuel efficiency. So all of these clauses really have new mechanisms which charter parties haven't seen before. This idea of working together, cooperating in good faith. We know that English law doesn't really recognize a doctrine of good faith. Okay, we know that this idea of mutual cooperation is even more ambiguous. But what these clauses are doing is they are really pushing the boundary in terms of what contract law can achieve, practically speaking, between parties. So there are some unique aspects to climate clauses, whether we see them in charter party forms or whether we see them in the implementation of green finance frameworks, is that we have the development of new norms. And these norms inform interpretation of obligations that might not necessarily have a sustainability or decarbonization objective. So can we really take a recital or purpose of loan or a preamble to one of these agreements and use it to interpret other non-green obligations in the contract itself? These new norms are also criticized as being overly vague. How do you actually implement them? I've also spoken about how many of them embed advanced warning mechanisms. So advanced warning mechanisms sit quite uncomfortably with the law of anticipatory breach in English contract law. So this is quite a problematic area in that you need to show incredibly high levels of evidence really that another party has evinced an intention to breach the contract. And there's also that risk of early termination if you cannot satisfy that high evidentiary threshold. So advanced warning mechanisms and how that might operate, how strong an obligation it is also a contentious area. There's also the administrative burden of data sharing. Okay, do we have the platforms available for this level of data sharing? Is the technology there? Will it be data sharing in real time? Is this an added cost for parties to implement these systems? And then also this idea that there's more than a commercial objective to contracting. There's an aspirational norm-driven agenda, which is one of better sustainability performance, achieving net zero or decarbonization. So really this aspirational behavior stems from an external source. And you might say, well, parties should have complete autonomy to simply act in their own best interest. Should we be looking at ways in which contract law can direct them towards a sustainability agenda? But I think the reality is that it's becoming harder and harder to separate the commercial profitability objectives of shipping actors from sustainability objectives. I think it's becoming quite difficult to classify risks as purely environmental risks or purely climate risks, when in fact they equate to monetary risks, credit risks. I think there's a lot of overlap there between commercial or business sustainability and environmental sustainability. So just conclusions on this. We've seen there's been huge development in green finance, and we've seen the contractual catch up with that. Lots of work being done to develop contractual forms, loan agreements to implement these frameworks. And we're seeing new mechanisms used in these loan forms that is really contributing to this contract law debate of what purpose should contract law be used for. Is contract governance something that should be part of the pluralistic governance toolbox? Is it the missing piece of the puzzle that hasn't been given a lot of attention? We've spoken a lot about regulatory agendas, private authority, private governance, but no one has really looked at how these initiatives, whether they be private governance initiatives or regulatory initiatives, how are they being implemented in practice? How are they actually changing and directing party behavior? So there is this shift to contract governance. We've seen this with the development of climate clauses to really get our heads around this idea how we can use traditional contract forms to implement new ideas. So really the idea of contract governance is building upon the work of private governance theories, yet is broader in respect of considerations because it considers the regulatory agenda, it considers a lot of external pressures on company behavior as well. And it really asks this main question, is contract law fit for sustainable purposes? Can we, in English contract law, envision things such as advanced warning mechanisms, green damages, new norms of cooperation? Should we just simply rely on the default rules we already have, or do they prevent barriers? Does the traditional architecture of charter party forms actually present a barrier to the implementation of decarbonisation? Do we need to look at new contractual forms? And this debate really continues not only in chartering arrangements, but in contract law more generally. Your colleagues, Professor, at the University of Oslo have just written a fantastic book called Quo Vadis Contract Law, which talks really about these debates and the reversion to formalism in England and Wales, but how in practice we're really seeing contract law used as a much more expansive tool for implementing the sustainability agenda. So that debate continues, but really industry is responding in a number of ways. And I've always said the problem is going to really be one of enforcing all these wonderful ideas. How do we give teeth to these private governance initiatives? And how do we really implement these green finance taxonomies? Because if we don't implement them properly, we are running a huge risk of anything can just be labeled as sustainable or green without proper implementation. So that is where I'm going to end for now. And I hope it shows that, contract governance really is something we need to pay attention to. And when it comes to the IMO regulatory agenda, the latest committee meeting of the Marine Environmental Protection Committee was mixed with mixed responses as to what these new ambitions and targets are. We don't really know what our packet of medium-term measures is going to be as of yet, but regardless of what those measures are, they're going to require implementation. And a lot of that is going to have to come down to contractual implementation. So that is my parting message. Thank you for listening to me today. Thank you.